Is don't you want to go to that land? I thought I saw 58. All right, well, this morning, we're going to talk about a very fascinating Bible story. And I've titled it, Dung, a Dead Dog, and David's Victory. And yes, this is in that chapter here. And it's one of those peculiar stories we find in the Bible that it's kind of weird setting, but it's actually an extremely interesting story. It's got the classic tale of jealousy, a epic hide-and-seek game, peer pressure, and going to the bathroom at the wrong time. It's all relatable, right? We've all been there before. I'm not going to say which one. But if you recall, just as a quick background to the story of David, if you remember, when he was a young man, Samuel was appointed by God to go and anoint one of Jesse's sons to be king. And it so happened that it was David, a young man, young shepherd's boy. But there is one problem with David being anointed king, if you recall. You see, on account of there's already a king. There is King Saul. And in fact, Saul didn't want to share that whole king thing. He kind of wanted to keep it for himself. And so, obviously, this put David in a very awkward situation. God has anointed him to be king. God has told him that he will lead the Israelites into victory, into battle, and that God was going to establish a covenant of kingdom with him. And yet, nothing really goes his way. I mean, at first it does, but Saul keeps getting in the way. In 1 Samuel 18 and verse 7, we kind of pick up on that jealousy that Saul had. It says, "And the women sang to one another as they celebrated, 'Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. If you notice, that's a greater number on David's account there. It says, "And Saul was very angry, and this saying displeased him. He said, 'They have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed thousands. And what more can he have but the kingdom?' And Saul eyed David from that day on." Saul had his eye on him. He was watching him. He assumed he was like sneaky or trying to usurp the power. But what Saul wasn't getting was, it wasn't David doing those things. David wasn't seeking to displace Saul. God was. God was fulfilling his purposes within David. 1 Samuel 18:10 tells us the next day, a harmful spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he raved within his house while David was playing the lyre, as he did day by day. Saul had his spear in his hand. Now, first off, this guy should not have spears. If you remember, Saul has kind of an issue with spears on account of he keeps throwing them at people. In verse 11, it says, "And Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, 'I will pin David to the wall.' But David evaded him twice." So even within that story, this isn't the first time he throws a spear at someone, but even within this one instance, it looks like he did it twice. He threw 2 spears. And you just think, poor David's just sitting there playing the lyre, trying to relax Saul because he's going crazy, and all of a sudden a spear comes flying out of nowhere. Now that is what I call uncalled for. I mean, can you imagine you're trying to help someone, you're trying to soothe them, they're having a bad time, and then all of a sudden they start throwing punches at you or throwing the kitchen knife at you? That'd be crazy, not very comfortable. So you can imagine David didn't like this too much. So much, in fact, that he continued a life as a fugitive. He ran repeatedly trying to escape from jealous Saul, seeking to squash him, to get rid of this threat to his kingdom. And actually, here's a map of all the different travelings that David did while he was running from Saul. So you can look, he was running all over Israel from this guy. And this isn't fun. And let me ask you something. Did David cause any of this? No, not really. Simply, he was doing what he knew to be right, and he was following what God had told him. And it just wasn't really working out for him. It wasn't very comfortable for him. And I've seen some scholars suggest that he was on the run for about 7 years. You think 7 years, it's kind of a short amount of time, but that's a big chunk of your life. You think of the changes that you went from 15 to 22. You think that's almost a whole life within itself. And Saul took that from David. He took it from him, from his jealousy and his fighting against God's will. So keep all that in mind as we read this chapter. In verse 1 of 1 Samuel 24, it says, "When Saul returned from following the Philistines, he was told, 'Behold, David is in the wilderness of En-gedi.' Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of all Israel and went to seek David and his men in front of the wild goats' rocks." That's a funny name. But you think Saul had 3,000, not just men, not just soldiers. It says chosen men. If you remember the posse that Saul went out with. You remember Doeg the Edomite? He was a pretty brutal guy. He killed God's priests. He slaughtered all of them. So you think Saul's chosen men, they probably weren't, lovely chip off the old block kind of guy. These were killers. These were killers, and he was surrounded by them. And here's actually some pictures of the sheep, goats, rocks in the wilderness of En-Gedi. I just thought that was interesting. It's a very cavernous region, so you can imagine that this probably looked like a perfect spot for David and his men to hide, because they knew Saul was after him. Verse 3, it says, "And he came to the sheepfolds by the way where there was a cave. And Saul went in to relieve himself." Latin Vulgate says, "cover his feet." So you can kind of get the image with that, what's going on there with Saul. It says, "Now David and his men were sitting in the innermost parts of the cave." That's a bit awkward. And then in verse 24, it says, "And the men of David said to him, 'Here is the day of which the Lord said to you, Behold, I will give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it shall seem good to you.' Then David arose and stealthily cut off a corner of Saul's robe. And afterward, David's heart struck him." That always blows my mind. David's heart struck him because he had cut off a corner of Saul's robe. He said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him, seeing he is the Lord's anointed." Have you ever done something like made a decision and immediately you just feel like, that was the wrong thing to do. That was the wrong decision. It just kind of pangs you. Now, David didn't do what his men were encouraging him to do. They were like, "Here's your chance, kill him, stab him, you won't see it coming." And then David just cuts off a corner of his robe, which serves him well. But even just doing that, even that little act just pricked his conscience. He just felt guilty and dirty about it, even though he didn't kill him, didn't cause any harm on him. And that just shows we can kind of get the picture of why David's called a man after God's own heart. And part of it is that just tenderness of the conscience. And so I think that's why it's so important to look. I love stories that involve David because I kind of can get an insight into how I should act, how I should respond in different situations. Verse 7, it says, "So David persuaded his men with these words and did not permit them to attack Saul. And Saul rose up and left the cave and went on his way. Afterward, David also arose and went out of the cave and called after Saul, 'My Lord the king.' And when Saul looked behind him, David bowed with his face to the earth and paid homage." He bows down to him. Shows him that he's submitting to this guy that's trying to kill him, that's throwing spears at him, wasted 7 years of his life. He bows down and pays homage to the king. It says, "And David said to Saul, 'Why do you listen to the words of men who say, Behold, David seeks your harm? Behold, this day your eyes have seen how the Lord gave you today into my hand in the cave. And some told me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not put out my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. See, my father, see the corner of your robe is in my hand. For by the fact that I cut off the corner of your robe and did not kill you, you may know and see that there is no wrong or treason in my hands. I have not sinned against you, though you hunt my life to take it." He's trying to kill him. Don't let that lose that on you. They aren't just like old chums. Saul has been trying to kill him for years. He says, "May the Lord judge between me and you. May the Lord avenge me against you, but my hand shall not be against you. As the proverb of the ancient says, out of the wicked comes wickedness, but my hand shall not be against you. After whom has the king of Israel come out? After whom do you pursue? After a dead dog? After a flea?" He's humbling himself. Look at the contrast. He says, the king of Israel. Who's the king of Israel come out? You're a king? I'm just a dead dog and a flea. I'm on the run. I'm moving. I'm not rich. I'm not wealthy. I'm just moving with my men, and we're trying to be saved. Why are you even wasting your time on me? I'm not worth it. Verse 15 says, "May the Lord therefore be judge and give sentence between me and you, and see to it and plead my cause and deliver me from your hand." As soon as David had finished speaking these words to Saul, Saul said, "Is this your voice, my son David?" And Saul lifted up his voice and wept. Why do you suppose he wept? Because he knew he was right. He knew David was right. He was convicted by the words. He realized, I am not doing right. I am in the wrong. He said to David, "You are more righteous than I, for you have repaid me good whereas I have repaid you evil. He acknowledges this. He knows you haven't caused me any harm. In fact, I'm causing harm to you, and you've just done me good. Verse 18, and you have declared this day how you have dealt with me, and that you did not kill me when the Lord put me into your hands. Saul even recognized that it was providential, that God gave him over to David. It says, for if a man finds his enemy, will he let him go away safe? So may the Lord reward you with good for what you have done to me this day. Now, I haven't thought this all the way through, but I just think that's an interesting statement. For if a man finds his enemy, will he let him go away safe? Well, I think what he means by that is, you let me go away safe, which means you don't view me as your enemy despite what I've done to you. That you still treat me with respect, and you still treat me with honor, and you don't see me as an enemy, and you're leaving it to God. So I think that's just a really powerful thing. What if we didn't have enemies? There may be people who intend us harm, but what if in our own heads you're not my enemy? Verse 20, it says, and now behold, I know that you shall surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand. Swear to me, therefore, by the Lord, that you will not cut off my offspring after me, and that you will not destroy my name out of my father's house. And David swore this to Saul. Then Saul went home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold. And just as a spoiler, Saul doesn't keep his end of the deal. He goes right back a little while later and goes hunting after David again, trying to kill him. But if you remember, David keeps in his covenant. He keeps his end of the deal, and he doesn't cut off Saul's name from his household. So even in death, David was a better man. So my point for us this morning is to see what lessons we can learn from this interaction. We know that these things were written for our learning, for our benefit, so we can know how to act in this world. And so I want to look at 5 applications to become more like someone who was after God's own heart and exhibited those traits well. The first one, being right doesn't give you a right. Being right does not give you a right. If you think, again, how much Saul had put David through. I mean, that was miserable. Can you imagine having to run quite literally for your life for 7 years straight? Worrying about where you're going to get your food. Someone actively has a mini military hunting you all the time. David had every right to be angry. He had every right to be upset and frustrated and even really violent. Because after all, the kingdom had been promised to David. He wasn't just trying to go out and do this selfishly. God had told him that he would be king. And there was someone that was trying to kill him and stop him from being that. Being from what God had declared him to be. And I think we all have people that have wronged us. That's part of being human. I think all of us have people that have done just something that either gets under our skin or just did something, some act of betrayal. And maybe it's currently happening. Maybe there are people who actively wrong you. Well, if you think of 1 Peter 3:8, it says, finally, all of you have unity of mind, sympathy, brotherly love, a tender heart, and a humble mind. That kind of all reminds me of David's attitudes in this passage, right? A tender heart, that his heart pricked him just when he cut off the cloak, and his humility in his speech. He says, do not repay evil for evil, or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, bless. For to this you were called, that you may obtain a blessing. I 100% acknowledge that you may have every right to feel angry, but you can be dead right. Just like you can be dead wrong, you can be dead right. And as a Christian, isn't it better to suffer a loss so that we can become more Christ-like in our suffering? Isn't that what Jesus ultimately did? He tells us in Luke 6:27, but I say to you who hear, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. I don't remember really praying for people who have abused me. That doesn't seem natural, does it? It's not natural to love your enemy. It wasn't quite natural for David to spare Saul's life. He had the right, but it didn't give him the right. When people gossip us, when people say bad things, try to ruin our reputation, try to steal from us, you name it, that doesn't give us a right to become unchristlike. And I fear sometimes we have the attitude of like, oh, well, I'm nice, but just don't cross me, or I'm going to be a good person. I'm going to be a good Christian. Unless you do something really mean to me, then that all goes out the window. It has to be a consistent heart thing. Love your enemies. Second, good friends can give bad advice. I'd say even godly friends can give bad advice. I think it's made evident by David's men, right? That were they like some like spies that were trying to bring David to his downfall? Absolutely not. These guys would kill for David. These guys would die for David. They were loyal to him. They were following him in rebellion to the king in a reality. And they say, right here, here's your chance. You can put all of this running to an end. He's done so many bad things to you. Just kill him. Just get it over with. Here's the time. In fact, I'll kill him for you. You don't even worry about it. I'll strike him down. And we can fulfill what God has promised. Well, I think sometimes we vent to our friends or, or family or something like that. We talk about maybe someone who did something that was just rude or they lied about you, you name it. What's the response that you get back? Is it full of, you better not let him treat you like that. You need to do X, Y, and Z. You should do this and get back. Oh, it'd be really good if you did this to get back at him. Now, a lot of times those people are well-intentioned. And I know I've been in the spot of giving advice like that before. And it's out of a place of love, but it's not the advice that's needed. If it's retaliatory in nature, then we need to respond like David. Because if you look at what he did once they said this, he explains to them. They said, he is the Lord's anointed. It says, so David persuaded his men. See that he didn't just give the command, no, be quiet, you're wrong. He reasons with it. And it says he persuades them. He was able to convict them, to change their minds. He reasoned with an overzealous and well-intentioned friends and reminded them of God's will. And that's exactly what we need to do. I mean, maybe someone gives us some advice that's just not Christ-like, and it may be well-intentioned, but that's a time to not just, be like, how dare you? You can't do that. It's reason with them, explain, I understand that, and I appreciate your heart in that, but here's why I can't act like that, because I have a higher standard. Proverbs 25:15 says, with patience a ruler may be persuaded, and a soft tongue will break a bone. And I just think even with us, sometimes as advice givers, we need to be reminded of that, to not be rash in action or our speech, but really think through the advice that we give when people confide in us about their struggles or people who are oppressing them. We need to be considerate with our speech. Third, respect authority even when they don't deserve it. And that's Saul, right? I mean, he was the king. He had the throne, but he didn't really deserve to be king. His actions weren't right. He was trying to kill someone that God had anointed, so he didn't, reciprocate the same courtesy that David extended him. But have you seen the way Christians talk about their bosses or politicians they don't like on Facebook or in person? Have you seen the discussions, the name-calling, the ugly words, the just unchristlike speech that comes from it? Romans 13:1 says, let every person be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Understand, politicians, even the ones we don't like, were instituted by God and by God's authority. And when we're talking about these politicians, keep in mind we're speaking of God's anointed, just like Saul. And they may not deserve it. I mean, they may be some real scumbags, but guess what? God put them in authority, and he has a purpose for them. So we need to be careful that we're not maligning God and God's authority by what he did. 1 Timothy 2:1 says, first of all, then, I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgivings be made for all people, for kings and all who are in high positions, that we may lead a peaceful and quiet life, godly and dignified in every way. Did y'all catch something in that? It says all people and all kings who are in high places. Now, that wasn't just their local kings. That wasn't just their country's kings. There's a universality, however you say it, to this verbiage. That's everyone. So, when's the last time you prayed for Putin? I've seen people on Facebook saying, pray for Ukraine. Absolutely, amen. I agree. Pray for Russia. Pray for North Korea. Pray for China. Pray for Australia. Pray for all those who are governing these different world countries, not just the United States of America. I think sometimes people think that Jesus died for America. Jesus died for the whole world. And he cares about other countries just as much as he cares about the United States. So we need to be careful in our attitudes, how we talk about these people that God has instituted. Elders, police, mayors, presidents, teachers, etc. These are all positions of authority that God has ordained, even the corrupt and the mean ones, even the ones that just get on your nerves or do everything you disagree with. God expects us to respect his authority because he's the deciding factor. And if I've learned anything from Daniel, it's that God is in control of all of it. And Hannah pointed this out to me on Wednesday night, and I kind of forgot about this. But you remember Paul was before the tribune, and then the high priest commands that he be struck. And the high priest servant smacks Paul across the face, and he says, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Paul says that. He kind of gets back. But then, and by the way, he's on trial not because he committed a crime or stole or nothing like that. It was for spreading the gospel. That's why he was in prison. And then they struck him. And then it says, those who stood by said, would you revile God's high priest? And look at Paul's response. It says, and Paul said, I did not know, brothers, that he was the high priest. For it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. This was an apostle who saw Christ with his own eyes and was spoken to and performed miracles and had raised someone from the dead. And here he is before a hypocritical and corrupt government system through the high priest that had been corrupted long since because of the Herodians, and he apologizes because he says, God expects me to honor authority. So before you think that you're like that, get that self-righteous indignation towards what you see as corruption, just think, am I better than Paul? Am I holier than Paul is? And yet, even he himself humbled himself to earthly authorities. And part of it's just letting go of our ego. And then fourth, embrace hard conversations. This is probably the most important one out of all these applications. Embrace hard conversations. When we face someone who is actively in the wrong, who's part of God's people, it's time to speak up. If you notice in 1 Samuel 24, verse 8, it says, afterward David also arose and went out of the cave and called after Saul, my lord, the king. David was the one that took the burden of responsibility of communication on himself. Even though he was the wronged party, yet he's the one that started and initiated this dialogue with Saul. Again, Saul was seeking his life. And how did he respond? He wanted to communicate. He wanted to see what was going on. And he chose the more difficult path. Because as far as I see it, he had two options. David had two options. One, kill him. That gets rid of all his worries, right? You kill Saul, now you're the king. You don't have to do anything. You got it. He wouldn't even see it coming because he was in a vulnerable position at the time, if you remember. It wouldn't be much of a fight back. He had it fair and square, and he didn't pursue it. So there's one easy way. What's the other one? Well, he could have stayed hidden in the cave, couldn't he? He could have just stayed back in the innermost part of the cave. Saul would have no idea and move on. In fact, this was kind of a risk for him to go out. Can you imagine David's adrenaline pumping? Because again, he has a whole army, 3,000 chosen men. He's just cut off the king's cloth. And then he starts departing, and he comes out of the cave. He leaves his place of safety to initiate this dialogue with Saul. That took some bravery. That took a lot of guts, more guts than killing him. It was talking. You think about that. It's more scary to talk sometimes than to kill. And this was the case for David. And in these dialogues, be forthright and honest, even in the face of danger, while remaining humble. And that's the hardest part. And this doesn't just apply with authorities. This applies to your husband, to your wife, with your kids, with your bosses, with your elders, with your brothers, with your sisters, with everyone you can think of. There has to be open, honest, and humble dialogue. You have to be able to call out. And that's the scary thing. There's been so many times where I have dreaded, I've been convicted, I need to address this, or I need to have a conversation with this brother or sister. And it's nerve-wracking. I mean, I feel that same, that cortisol starts pumping in my body and my heart's beating out of my chest. I hate conflict. I don't like those hard conversations. But they're necessary. And David kind of called him to the mat on it too. 1 Timothy 5:1 says, do not rebuke an older man, but encourage him as you would a father. Younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, younger women as sisters, in all purity. And that's the manner that we take when we have these dialogues. It's not just, you did this and I'm so mad at you. Right, that's out there. It's for encouragement. that you make sure that your tone with these people are as if you're talking to your dad or your mom or your brother or your sister from that same place of love, not seeing them as an enemy, but as a family member. And that's why you're willing to have these dialogues. And he didn't nicify the situation, right? He didn't say, there might have been a miscommunication between you and I, right? He says, you're trying to kill me, and I've done nothing wrong to you. He called his and Saul's integrity to the mat while recognizing that he was a dead dog and a flea. You can see that you can be forthright and honest without being arrogant or boastful. Those things can exist at the same time, and that's what we need to emulate. And if we avoid the conflict, that's only going to lead to resentment in your marriage, work, or the church. And that's the truth. If you don't confront these things when the issues arise forthrightly and truthfully in your speech, that just leaves a whole playing ground for Satan to capitalize on. That's why you need to make the best of it now and make sure you're on the same page. Galatians 6:1 says, brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Keep watch on yourself, lest you too be tempted. Finally, extend grace to those in embarrassing situations. What happened with Saul, right? I mean, he was kind of in an embarrassing situation. And David didn't capitalize on it. He didn't take advantage of it. He relented. Remember, it says he went in to relieve himself. That's how he caught him. It would have been super easy to kill him. In verse 5, it says, and afterward, David's heart struck him. We talked about his sensitive conscience. It reminds me of Titus 3 in verse 1. It says, remind them to be submissive to rulers and authorities, to be obedient, to be ready for every good work, to speak evil of no one. Speak evil of no one. How often do we break that, honestly? How many times do you just get fed up with someone and then you complain about them to another person? Speak evil of no one, to avoid quarreling, to be gentle, and to show perfect courtesy to all people. That's even when they're wronging you. That's even when people who are wronging you, and maybe you get that dirt on them. Maybe you just catch them doing something. Oh, buddy, now you can enact your revenge for all the suffering they've put you through. That's the moment that you extend perfect courtesy, as David did. And these things are kind of some of the most difficult parts of being a Christian, is loving your enemies and extending courtesy to all people. That's even the people that make you mad, the people that hurt your feelings. Matthew 18:21, it says, then Peter came up and said to him, Lord, how often will my brother sin against me, and I forgive him? As many as 7 times? Jesus said, I do not say to you 7 times, but 77 times, or 7 times, I forget what the other translation says. But you keep forgiving them. That's the point. That even when they're wrong, if they're in an embarrassing situation, that there's not a limit. I mean, David didn't go around and say, well, you've been trying to kill me this whole time, so I don't really trust you. And now you're my enemy, and I'm going to try to do things the rest of my life to sabotage your kingdom. He goes about his business. He separates, right? He goes into the stronghold. He doesn't pursue Saul. He doesn't pursue vengeance. He leaves it to God. But why should we do this? It's because we too have shown malice. Because we too have been wrong. Because we too have wronged others. We've all defrauded each other, lied to each other, gossiped about each other, hurt people that are made in the image of God. Titus 3:3 tells us as much. It says, for we ourselves were once foolish, disobedient, led astray, slaves to various passions and pleasures, passing our days in malice and envy, hated by others, and hating one another. We've all been in that bitterness of sin, in that bitterness of self, when you rely on yourself and you do what you want to do. We've all been here. It doesn't lead to anything fruitful or peaceful or unifying. It's all divisive and brother fighting against brother. And it's not going to change unless we learn to let it go, to be like David, take the high road, even when it's not easy. So our applications from the story is being right doesn't give you the right. Good friends can give bad advice. Respect authority even when they don't deserve it. Embrace hard conversations and extend grace to those in embarrassing situations. And speaking of embarrassing situations, I can't help but think of Romans 5, verse 8. It says, but God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners. It's kind of like while we were Saul, wronging and defrauding each other and going after against the people that God has anointed and going against in rebellion to Christ's kingship. We acted like he wasn't the king, and we all went our own ways. And it was at that time that Christ died for me and for you. He says, since therefore we have now been justified by his blood, much more shall we be saved by him from the wrath of God. We have all been in the wrong, and Christ found us in an embarrassing situation, but he didn't leave us there. And so that leaves us with the question of the day. Are we going to be like Saul and have a fickle relationship with King Jesus, as Saul did with David, right? He kept going back and forth. Oh, I'm going to hunt you. And oh, I'm sorry I did that. And, oh, I'm going to hunt you again. And, oh, I'm sorry I did that. Do we act like Saul with the kingship of Christ? Do we buck against it and then go along with it, then go against it and go along with it? We have to submit to the kingship of Christ. We have to stay true to our covenant. And if you have not entered into that covenant with Christ, you're missing out. You're missing out on the peace, the blessings, just to have the peace of mind that it's possible for you to never have an enemy. You think about that? Because if you love your enemy, that's not your enemy. You have that ability, and it can only be found through Christ. And how you enter that covenant is through baptism, through the watery grave of baptism, that we're washed in Christ's blood and raised up, resurrected, a new creature in preparation for the resurrection in the future. Because, brothers and sisters, I believe it. 1 Corinthians 15 just tells us over and over that without the resurrection, there's no hope. Do you believe that one day we are going to die and that one day we are going to raise up once again? Christ will raise us up and set us before judgment. You can submit to his kingship now, or you can bend down on one knee later, but at that point you hadn't lived in submission to the king. And we'll hear those sad words, "Depart from me, I never knew you, you workers of lawlessness." Let's let that not be said of us, right? We want to hear good, well done, my good and faithful servant. If you would like to address anything or repent or become a Christian, we ask that you please come forward as we sing number 50.